A scream cut through the corridor of Blackmore Estate, and Serafina Ashcombe froze with her hand still resting on the cold handle of her bedroom door. It was the night before her wedding, and the house should have been silent except for the soft rustle of servants preparing flowers for the morning. Instead, she heard low voices coming from the study below, sharp and urgent, speaking words she was never meant to hear. She crept to the top of the stairs, her white nightgown brushing against the polished wood, and listened. Two men were speaking, their voices muffled but clear enough to understand. One of them was Lord Gregory Vane, a neighboring lord who had wanted her hand in marriage for years before Duke Alaric Thorne had won her heart instead. The other voice belonged to a man she did not recognize, rough and businesslike, discussing payment and timing, as though arranging nothing more than a delivery of goods. But the goods they spoke of was her life. Serafina's heart pounded so loudly she feared they might hear it through the floor. Lord Vane's voice grew colder as he explained that the bride must never reach the altar, that if she could not be his, she would belong to no one, and that the accident should look natural, something the Duke would mourn but never question. The stranger agreed, and coins clinked together in the dark. She stepped back from the stairs so quickly she nearly fell. Her mind raced through every possibility. She could run to Alaric's chamber and wake him, but Vane's man had said there were watchers posted near the Duke's wing that very night, ready to silence anyone who interfered. She could call for the guards, but she did not know how many of them had already been paid to look away. In that single terrifying moment, Serafina understood that the only way to keep Alaric safe, and to keep herself alive, was to disappear before the sun rose. She moved through her room with trembling hands, pulling a plain woolen cloak over her nightgown, and stuffing a small pouch of coins and her mother's silver locket into a hidden pocket she had sewn months ago, never imagining she would need it for something like this. She did not pause to write a letter. There was no time, and any message could be found and used against Alaric later. She only allowed herself one look at the window facing the east wing, where she knew the Duke was sleeping peacefully, unaware that danger stood just outside his walls. "I will find a way back to you," she whispered to the glass, and then she climbed out through the servants' passage she had discovered as a curious child visiting Blackmore years before anyone imagined she would live there as its future duchess. The night air was sharp and cold against her face, as she slipped through the kitchen garden and into the dark line of trees beyond the estate walls. Behind her, the house remained silent, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight, unaware that its future mistress was running for her life through the woods. She did not look back, because she knew if she did, she might lose the courage to keep moving. The forest path was uneven and rough beneath her thin shoes, and more than once she stumbled over roots hidden by fallen leaves. She could hear distant sounds behind her, the snap of branches, voices calling to one another, and she quickened her pace until her lungs burned. She did not know these woods well, only that they eventually led toward the river, and beyond the river lay a road that connected to the nearest town. When she reached the riverbank, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold on to the low branches that helped her climb down the muddy slope. The moon reflected on the water in broken silver pieces, and for a moment she considered how easy it would be to simply vanish into the current and let everyone believe she had drowned. It was a desperate thought, but as she stood there catching her breath, she realized it might actually be her best chance at survival. If Vane believed her dead, he would stop searching. If Alaric believed her dead, he would grieve, but he would live. And one day, somehow, she could find a way to return to him when it was finally safe. With trembling fingers, she untied the delicate veil she had planned to wear the next day, the one she had carried with her without even realizing it, tucked beneath her cloak in her hurry. She let it fall onto a jagged rock near the water's edge, hoping it would be found and taken as proof that she had fallen into the river during her escape. It was a painful thing to leave behind, a symbol of the life she had dreamed of sharing with Alaric, but she told herself it was only fabric, and fabric could not keep her alive the way clear thinking could. She turned away from the river and followed the bank downstream instead of crossing it, moving carefully to avoid leaving footprints in the soft mud. Her plan, if it could even be called a plan in those terrifying first hours, was simple. She would reach the town of Ashford Hollow by morning, find a way to earn a little money without drawing attention, and then travel as far from Vane's reach as possible. She would become someone else, someone with no title, no estate, and no wedding waiting for her. Because a nobleman's daughter fleeing for her life could be tracked and found, but a nameless young woman could disappear into the crowd of the world. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, Serafina had reached the outskirts of Ashford Hollow, exhausted, her feet blistered and her cloak stained with mud. She found an old barn on the edge of a farm and hid inside it, burying herself in a pile of hay to stay warm and out of sight. She did not sleep. Instead, she lay awake thinking of Alaric waking that morning. walking down the aisle of Blackmore's chapel, with no bride waiting for him. And the thought brought tears she quickly wiped away, knowing she could not afford to be weak now. Back at Blackmore, the wedding day unfolded into chaos. Guests arrived dressed in their finest clothing, musicians tuned their instruments, and the chapel filled with the soft murmur of excited conversation. But as the hour approached and Serafina did not appear, whispers of confusion turned into worry, and worry soon turned into panic. Duke Alaric Thorne stood at the altar in his formal coat, watching the chapel doors, certain at first that she was simply nervous, or that her carriage had been delayed. When servants ran to her chamber and found it empty, with the window to the passage left open, and her wedding dress untouched on its stand, Alaric felt something cold settle in his chest, that he would carry with him for years to come. He led the search himself, refusing to remain seated while others combed the grounds. He rode through the woods calling her name until his voice grew hoarse, and when his men found her torn veil resting on the rocks near the river, his entire world seemed to collapse into that single piece of fabric. He knelt beside the water for a long time, unable to accept what the evidence suggested, unwilling to believe that the woman he loved had been lost to the current in the darkness of the previous night. Lord Vane arrived at Blackmore that same afternoon, offering his condolences with a carefully composed expression of sorrow, suggesting gently that perhaps the bride had grown frightened of marriage and wandered too close to the water in her distress. Alaric barely registered the words, too consumed by grief and disbelief to notice the strange calmness in Vane's eyes, the way his sympathy never quite reached the rest of his face. It would be years before Alaric understood the significance of that visit, years before he realized that grief had blinded him to the truth standing directly in front of him. The search continued for weeks. Alaric hired trackers from neighboring counties, offered rewards for any information, and refused to accept the quiet suggestions from his advisors that perhaps it was time to hold a proper memorial and move forward. He walked the riverbank himself nearly every evening, staring into the water as though it might finally give back what it had taken. The kingdom's physicians and investigators eventually declared that given the strength of the current that night and the passage of time without any further sign of her, Lady Serafina Ashcombe must be presumed dead. Alaric never fully accepted the word presumed. He kept her portrait hanging in the Great Hall, refused every attempt by his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, to introduce him to other noblewomen, and slowly transformed from a warm and hopeful young man into someone guarded and distant, a duke who ruled his lands with careful precision, but allowed no one close enough to touch the wound that never fully closed. Meanwhile, in the barn outside Ashford Hollow, a frightened young woman with dirt on her hands and grief in her heart made a decision that would shape the next 7 years of her life. She could not return to Blackmore, not yet, not while Vane's influence stretched across the region and his hired men might still be watching for any sign that she had survived. She would need patience, a new name, and the strength to become someone entirely different until the day finally came when it was safe to reveal the truth. As the sun rose fully over the fields that morning, Serafina Ashcombe quietly said goodbye to her old life, and somewhere deep inside the exhaustion and fear, a small flicker of determination began to grow, the first seed of a plan that would eventually lead her back to the man she loved. That evening, a kind farmer's wife named Beatrice found her hiding in the barn while searching for eggs, and instead of turning her away, she offered a warm meal and a place to rest, asking no questions beyond what the frightened young woman was willing to share. Serafina gave her only a first name, a false one, and let the older woman believe she was fleeing an unwanted arrangement rather than a plot against her life. It was the first of many small lies she would learn to tell in order to survive, and though each one weighed on her conscience, she reminded herself that every lie was another day closer to the moment she could finally tell the truth to the only person who truly mattered. As she lay in the small guest room Beatrice offered her that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was not her own, Serafina pressed her hand against the hidden pocket of her cloak, feeling the outline of her mother's locket beneath the fabric. It was the only piece of her old life she allowed herself to keep close, a quiet reminder of who she truly was beneath whatever name she would soon choose. Outside the window, the stars looked exactly the same as they had over Blackmore, and she told herself that somewhere beneath that same sky, Alaric was safe, and that alone made everything she had given up feel almost bearable. She closed her eyes, exhausted beyond measure, and allowed herself to finally weep, not for the wedding she had lost, but for the years of silence and distance she now understood would stand between them before she could ever return to his side. 7 years passed, and the halls of Blackmore Estate had changed in ways that went far beyond the new tapestries and repainted walls. Duke Alaric Thorne had grown into a man the servants both respected and quietly feared, a leader whose decisions were sharp, and whose patience for foolishness had worn thin with time. He rose before dawn each day, reviewed reports from every corner of his territory, and rarely smiled unless duty required it of him. His mother, Dowager Duchess Margaret, had long given up trying to convince him to remarry, though she never stopped hoping that somewhere beneath the cold discipline, the warm young man she once knew still existed. The portrait of Seraphina still hung in the great hall, though most of the household staff had come and gone in the years since her disappearance, and few of the newer servants understood the full weight of the story behind it. They only knew that the Duke paused before it sometimes late at night, when he believed no one was watching, and that no one was permitted to speak her name carelessly in his presence. What none of them knew, what not even Alaric could have imagined, was that the woman in that portrait was alive, living under a different name in a distant port city, carrying scars that had nothing to do with the river everyone believed had taken her. In those 7 years, Seraphina had become someone new. She called herself Elena Voss, a name she had chosen carefully from a merchant she once overheard speaking fondly of a departed sister with that name. She had left Beatrice's farm within a few months of her escape, understanding that staying too long near Ashford Hollow risked drawing attention from anyone still searching on Lord Vane's behalf. She traveled first to a small coastal town, then further still, eventually settling in the bustling trading city of Halvorn, far enough from Blackmoor that no one there had ever heard the name Ashcombe. Survival had not come easily. In her first year alone, Elena worked as a seamstress, mending torn clothing for dock workers and sailors, who barely noticed the quiet young woman with careful hands and sad eyes. She slept in a rented room above a bakery, learning quickly how to stretch a small amount of coin across an entire week. Skills no noblewoman was ever taught, but every survivor eventually mastered. There were nights she cried herself to sleep thinking of the wedding that never happened, of Alaric's face the last time she had seen him laughing freely at dinner the evening before everything fell apart. But she forced herself each morning to rise and continue, because grief alone would not keep her safe. It was during her second year in Halvorn that she met Nathaniel Cross, an aging merchant who ran a modest but respected trading company along the docks. He had noticed her sharp mind while she helped mend sails for his ships, quick with numbers and careful with details in a way that impressed him more than her needlework ever had. When he offered her a position keeping his accounts, she accepted without hesitation, grateful for steady work that did not require explaining her past. Nathaniel never asked too many questions, though Elena suspected he understood she was hiding from something. He simply told her once, over a cup of tea during a quiet evening at his office, that everyone in Halvorn carried a story they preferred not to share, and that he judged people by their honesty in business rather than the shadows in their past. His trust became one of the few steady things in her new life, and under his guidance, she learned the trading business from the ground up, from negotiating fair prices to understanding the shifting demands of markets across the region. By her 4th year, Elena Voss had become known throughout Halvorn's trading circles as sharp, reliable, and unusually skilled at reading people during negotiations, a skill she had unknowingly developed from years of watching every stranger for signs of danger. She rose within Nathaniel's company from a simple clerk to his most trusted assistant, eventually managing contracts and travel arrangements that took her to towns and cities she never imagined visiting in her old life as a sheltered nobleman's daughter. Yet despite the success she built, despite the new friendships and the quiet stability of her days, Elena never fully let go of who she truly was. She kept her mother's locket hidden in a small wooden box beneath her bed, and on nights when the loneliness became too heavy to bear, she would hold it and think of Alaric, wondering if he had moved on, wondering if he even remembered her the way she remembered him, wondering if returning would only bring danger back into his life, rather than the joy she once imagined their reunion might hold. She heard news of Blackmoor only occasionally, carried through traveling merchants who mentioned the Duke's territory in passing while discussing trade routes and taxation policies. She learned, through careful and quiet questions asked without revealing her interest, that the Duke had never remarried, that he ran his lands firmly but fairly, and that Lord Gregory Vane had expanded his own influence considerably in the years since her disappearance, absorbing smaller territories through arrangements that seemed, to those who knew where to look, less like alliances and more like quiet threats made real. This information troubled Elena deeply. If Vane had grown more powerful, returning to reveal her survival could still place both herself and Alaric in greater danger than before. She spent long nights turning the problem over in her mind, weighing the risk of remaining hidden forever against the growing ache of years spent apart from the only person who had ever truly known her heart. The turning point came during her 6th year in Halvorn, when Nathaniel fell seriously ill and, sensing his time was limited, called Elena to his bedside to discuss the future of his trading company. he told her, with surprising tenderness for a man who had always kept his emotions carefully guarded, that she had become like a daughter to him, and that he intended to leave a portion of his business connections and reputation in her care, trusting her to continue the honest work he had built over decades. Nathaniel passed away peacefully a few months later, and his final gift to Elena, beyond his trust and his teachings, was an introduction he had arranged before his passing, to a trading company seeking a reliable accounts manager for an expanding contract in the Northern Territories, specifically within the lands governed by Duke Alaric Thorne. When Elena first read the details of the assignment, her hands trembled so badly she had to set the papers down and walk to the window for air. It felt impossible, almost like fate mocking her with an opportunity she had both longed for and feared in equal measure. Returning to Blackmore's territory meant stepping back into the shadow of everything she had run from. But it also meant, for the first time in 7 years, standing close enough to see Alaric again, even if only from a careful distance, even if he never learned the truth of who she truly was. She spent nearly 2 weeks deliberating before finally accepting the assignment, telling herself it was simply practical, that the contract offered fair payment and valuable connections for her growing reputation within the trading world. But beneath that reasoning, she knew the truth. She needed to see him, needed to know if he was safe and well, needed to understand whether the wound she had left behind had ever truly healed, even if she could never allow herself to fully reopen it by revealing her identity. Before departing Halvorn, Elena made careful preparations, adopting mannerisms and habits distinct enough from her old identity to avoid recognition. Cutting her once long hair to a shorter, more practical length, favored by working women in trade professions, and practicing a slightly different manner of speech, flatter and more businesslike than the soft cadence of a noblewoman raised in Blackmore's halls. She told herself these changes were simply professional necessities, but privately she understood she was also building armor, protecting the fragile hope inside her chest from being crushed the moment she stood once again in front of the man she had never stopped loving. The journey north took several weeks, traveling first by ship along the coast and then overland through territories that grew increasingly familiar the closer she came to Blackmore. She recognized the shape of distant hills she had once ridden past as a child, the particular color of autumn leaves in forests she had explored long before Vane's cruelty had ever entered her life. Each familiar landmark stirred a mixture of comfort and painful memory, and by the time her carriage finally crossed into the outer boundary of Alaric's territory, her heart was pounding with a nervous energy she had not felt in 7 long years. She arrived in the market town nearest to Blackmore Estate on a quiet afternoon, the same town where she had once attended festivals as a young noblewoman full of hope for her future. Nothing about the town recognized her now, and she moved through its streets as a stranger, checking into a modest inn under the name Elena Voss, preparing herself for the meeting scheduled the following morning with representatives of the Duke's household regarding the trading contract that had brought her back to the one place in the world she had never expected to see again. That night, unable to sleep, Elena sat by the window of her small inn room, staring out toward the distant silhouette of Blackmore Estate, visible against the darkening sky. Candlelight flickered faintly in some of its windows, and she wondered which room belonged to Alaric now, whether he still kept the same study, whether his laughter still sounded the way she remembered it echoing through the halls during quieter, happier days. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and whispered a silent promise to herself, that whatever happened in the coming days, whatever risks awaited her within those familiar walls, she would face them with the same courage that had carried her through 7 years of hiding. Tomorrow, for the first time since the night she vanished, Seraphina Ashcombe would stand close enough to see the Duke of Blackmore again, hidden behind the careful disguise of a woman named Elena Voss, uncertain whether fate had brought her home to finally heal her broken heart, or simply to reopen a wound that had never truly closed. Morning arrived too quickly for Elena's liking, the pale light slipping through the inn window before she had managed more than a few restless hours of sleep. She dressed carefully in a plain but well-tailored coat suited for business meetings, pulled her hair back into a neat and practical style, and reminded herself, as she had done countless times during the journey north, that she was Elena Voss, a trading company representative, and nothing more. She repeated the name in her mind like a shield, hoping it would be enough to steady her nerves once she stood within the walls of Blackmore Estate. The carriage ride to the estate felt shorter than she remembered, the winding road through the front gates, achingly familiar despite the years that had passed. Stone walls she once walked freely, as its future mistress now loomed above her as a stranger arriving on business, and she forced her expression into calm professionalism, even as her chest tightened with every turn of the wheels bringing her closer to the main house. A steward greeted her at the entrance, a younger man she did not recognize, which brought a small measure of relief, since it meant at least one less risk of being discovered by someone who might remember her true face. He led her through corridors that still held their familiar arrangement of paintings and furniture, though everything appeared slightly more austere than she remembered, as though the warmth that once filled these halls had slowly faded away over the years. She was brought to a formal meeting room, where several members of the Duke's household staff were already gathered around a long table, discussing the details of the proposed trading contract for goods moving through the Northern Territories. Elena took her seat and opened her ledgers, focusing entirely on the numbers before her, grateful for the familiar routine of business that gave her something concrete to hold on to amid the storm of memories threatening to overwhelm her. The meeting proceeded smoothly for nearly half an hour before the door opened again, and every person at the table rose respectfully to their feet. Elena stood as well, following the expected formality, and then she turned toward the doorway and felt the entire world tilt sideways beneath her. Duke Alaric Thorne entered the room with the same commanding presence she remembered, though 7 years had carved new lines into his face and added a weight to his shoulders that had not existed during their happier days together. His dark hair was cut shorter now, his expression composed into careful neutrality, and yet his eyes still held that same intensity she had fallen in love with so many years before. For a single terrifying moment, Elena feared her face would betray everything, that 7 years of careful discipline would crumble the instant he looked at her. But Alaric's gaze passed over her only briefly, the way any nobleman might glance at an unfamiliar business representative, before he addressed the table with brisk professionalism, discussing terms and expectations for the trading arrangement. Elena forced her breathing to remain steady, answering his questions regarding shipping schedules and payment structures with the same calm efficiency she had used in countless negotiations across the past 7 years, though her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if anyone else in the room could hear it. It was near the end of the meeting, as Elena reached across the table to hand him a signed copy of the proposed contract, that Alaric paused. His fingers brushed briefly against hers as he accepted the papers, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of confusion crossing his otherwise composed features. His eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach twist with fear. "Have we met before?" he asked, his voice quieter now, meant only for her rather than the rest of the room. Elena's mind raced through every possible response, and she settled on the safest one available. "I do not believe so, Your Grace. Perhaps I simply resemble someone from your past." Alaric's expression remained thoughtful for a moment longer before he nodded slowly, seeming to accept the explanation, though something in his gaze suggested the answer had not entirely satisfied him. The meeting concluded shortly after, and Elena excused herself as quickly as etiquette allowed, retreating to the carriage waiting outside with her hands trembling around her ledgers. That evening, back at her modest inn room, Elena sat by the window replaying the encounter over and over in her mind. She had prepared herself for the emotional weight of seeing Alaric again, but she had not prepared herself for the way his gaze had studied her so carefully, as though some part of him recognized something beneath the surface of her careful disguise. She told herself it was simply the natural reaction of a man who had once loved deeply and never fully healed, a mind searching for echoes of loss in unfamiliar faces. But a small, frightened part of her wondered if 7 years apart had not been enough to erase the connection they once shared. 2 days later, a messenger arrived at her inn carrying an unexpected offer. The Duke's household required a temporary accounts manager to oversee the details of the expanding trading contract directly from within Blackmore Estate. Given the complexity of the arrangement and the need for someone experienced to coordinate between multiple merchant companies, Elena's business reputation, built carefully over years under Nathaniel's guidance, had apparently impressed the household enough that they wished to offer her the position for the duration of the contract negotiations, complete with lodging within the estate itself. Elena stared at the letter for a long time, before finally setting it down, torn between overwhelming fear and a desperate, aching hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Living within Blackmore Estate meant proximity to Alaric on a daily basis, meant countless opportunities for her disguise to slip, meant walking hallways that still held memories capable of shattering her careful composure at any moment. But it also meant something she had quietly longed for since the night she fled 7 years earlier, a chance to be near him again, even if he could never know the truth of who she truly was. After another sleepless night of deliberation, Elena accepted the position, telling herself once again that it was simply a practical business decision, that declining such an opportunity would raise unnecessary questions about her professional judgment. She packed her few belongings the following morning and moved into a modest guest chamber within Blackmore Estate, careful to keep her mother's locket hidden safely within her luggage, where no curious servant might stumble upon it. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm. Elena spent her mornings reviewing contracts and shipping schedules in a small office near the estate's business wing, occasionally crossing paths with Alaric during household meetings where the trading arrangement required his direct oversight. She learned to school her expression into careful neutrality whenever he entered a room, forcing herself to treat him with the same measured professionalism she extended to any other client, though every glance he offered her sent a fresh wave of longing and fear through her chest. Alaric, for his part, seemed to find himself drawn to her presence in ways that visibly puzzled him. He began finding small reasons to consult with her directly rather than through intermediaries, asking her opinion on trading decisions that hardly required his personal attention, lingering in doorways when their conversations concluded as though reluctant to end their exchanges. The household staff began to notice, exchanging quiet glances whenever the Duke's schedule seemed to align unusually often with the new accounts manager's working hours. Dowager Duchess Margaret noticed as well, and one afternoon she invited Elena to join her for tea in the estate's smaller sitting room, an invitation Elena could hardly refuse given the woman's position within the household. Over delicate porcelain cups, Margaret studied her guest with sharp, observant eyes, asking careful questions about her background and travels that Elena answered with practiced, vague responses honed over years of protecting her true identity. "You remind me of someone," Margaret said eventually, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. "Someone my son loved very deeply, many years ago." Elena's throat tightened, and she forced herself to maintain a polite, curious expression. "I hope that is not an unpleasant comparison, Your Grace." Margaret's gaze softened slightly, though it remained sharp with unspoken suspicion. "No, my dear. It is simply an observation I could not help but make. Grief has a way of making us see familiar faces in strangers, does it not?" The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Elena left the meeting with her nerves stretched thin, increasingly aware that her disguise, however carefully constructed, could not withstand indefinite scrutiny from those who had known Serafina Ashcombe intimately before her disappearance. Her fears deepened further one evening nearly 3 weeks into her stay at Blackmore, when she discovered, quite by accident, an old scar along her wrist beginning to show more visibly after a long day working outdoors under the sun, the same distinctive mark she had received as a child falling from a garden wall, a mark Alaric had once kissed gently during a quiet evening together, before everything fell apart. She had nearly forgotten how visible it could become, and she quickly began wearing long sleeves regardless of the weather, terrified that such a small detail might be the thread that finally unraveled everything she had built to protect them both. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Elena, word of her arrival within Blackmore's territory had begun traveling through certain channels far less friendly than the Duke's household staff. A merchant familiar with trading circles in Halvorn mentioned, during casual conversation at a tavern near Vane's territory, the impressive reputation of a young accounts manager named Elena Voss who had recently relocated north to manage contracts for Duke Thorne's estate. The description of her sharp business mind, her particular manner of speech, and even certain small physical details reached ears that recognized the pattern far too clearly for comfort. Lord Gregory Vane, older now but no less calculating than the man who had once plotted Serafina's demise, received this information with a slow, dawning suspicion that chilled him more than he cared to admit. He had believed, for 7 long years, that the girl who slipped through his fingers on the night before her wedding had truly perished in the river, her disappearance a convenient tragedy that closed the matter permanently. The possibility that she had survived, and worse, that she had returned to the very territory he had spent years quietly working to weaken and absorb, threatened everything he had carefully built since her disappearance. He summoned Simon Blackwell, a man who had served him loyally in matters requiring discretion since the very night Serafina vanished, and instructed him to travel quietly to Blackmore's territory to confirm whether the rumors held any truth. If Serafina Ashcombe had indeed survived and returned under a false identity, Vane understood clearly that she now posed a far greater threat than she ever had as a frightened young bride, because a woman who had survived his plot once, who understood the danger he represented, could not be allowed to threaten his position a second time. Simon departed within days, arriving in the market town near Blackmore under the guise of a traveling merchant, quietly asking careful questions among tavern keepers and stable hands, gathering small details about the mysterious Elena Voss who had recently taken up residence within the Duke's household. Each answer he received brought him closer to a suspicion he dared not yet report back to Vane without further confirmation, understanding the severity of the consequences should he act on false information. Back within Blackmore's walls, entirely unaware of the danger quietly gathering around her once again, Elena continued navigating the delicate balance between her professional duties and the growing, undeniable pull she felt toward Alaric with each passing day. Late one evening, working alone in her small office reviewing shipping manifests by candlelight, she looked up to find Alaric standing quietly in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not quite read, one that carried both curiosity and something far more vulnerable beneath its careful composure. "You work later than any member of my household," he said softly, stepping into the room. "Even later than I do, and I am told I work far too much." Elena managed a small, careful smile, setting down her pen. "The contract requires precision, Your Grace. I would rather finish correctly than quickly." Alaric studied her for a long moment, and then, almost hesitantly, he asked a question that made her blood run cold. "Miss Voss, may I ask where you were 7 years ago?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them spoke aloud. Elena felt her carefully constructed composure waver dangerously, and she understood, in that single suspended moment, that the safety of her disguise, and perhaps everything she had built to protect the man standing before her, now depended entirely on how carefully she chose her next words. Elena's heart pounded so violently she feared Alaric might notice the pulse visible at her throat. She held his gaze, forcing herself to remain composed even as every instinct urged her to look away. 7 years ago I was quite young, Your Grace, working as a seamstress in a small coastal town. I do not recall it being a particularly remarkable time in my life." Alaric studied her expression carefully, and for a moment she feared he could see straight through the careful fabric of her lie. But then he simply nodded, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. "Forgive the strange question. I lost someone very dear to me around that time, and there are moments when the world seems determined to remind me of her." "I am sorry for your loss," Elena said quietly, and the words carried a weight of sincerity that surprised even her, though Alaric could not possibly understand how deeply she meant them. He excused himself shortly after, leaving Elena alone with her racing thoughts and trembling hands. She understood now that her presence within Blackmore was becoming increasingly dangerous, not because anyone had discovered concrete proof of her identity, but because Alaric's instincts, sharpened by years of unresolved grief, continued drawing him toward the truth in ways she could not fully control. She began seriously considering whether the wisest course of action might be to complete the trading contract as quickly as possible, and quietly withdraw from Blackmore's territory, before the fragile threads holding her disguise together finally snapped. That plan, however, was disrupted only days later by an event that shattered the uneasy peace she had been carefully maintaining. Elena was returning from the market town late one afternoon, traveling alone in a small carriage to collect supplies for the estate's business office, when the vehicle suddenly lurched violently to one side, throwing her hard against the door before the wheels ground to a halt with a sickening crack. She managed to steady herself and peer outside, her heart hammering with alarm, only to discover that one of the carriage wheels had been deliberately loosened, the bolts clearly tampered with rather than simply worn from use. Shaken but uninjured, Elena climbed carefully from the damaged carriage, scanning the empty road in both directions with growing unease. It could have been an unfortunate accident, she told herself, though something deep within her instincts, honed by years of careful vigilance, insisted otherwise. She walked the remaining distance back to Blackmore Estate on foot, her mind racing through every possibility, wondering whether her disguise had finally failed and whether the danger she had fled 7 years earlier had somehow found her once again. She said nothing of her suspicions to the household staff, reporting only that the carriage wheel had broken during her journey, unwilling to draw further attention to herself while uncertain of the true cause. But that night, unable to sleep, she carefully checked the locks on her chamber door and window, keeping her mother's locket close beside her rather than hidden away in her luggage, a small comfort against the fear steadily growing within her chest. The following morning, Simon Blackwell, having gathered enough information to feel reasonably confident in his suspicions, made the difficult decision to attempt direct confirmation rather than simply reporting uncertain rumors back to Lord Vane. He approached Elena under the guise of a traveling merchant seeking business advice regarding trade routes through the Northern Territories, engaging her in careful conversation near the market square during her afternoon errands. Elena, trained by years of careful survival to remain alert to unfamiliar faces showing too much interest in her background, grew increasingly wary as the conversation continued, noticing the way the stranger's questions circled subtly around her past, rather than the trading matters he claimed to seek advice on. When he mentioned, seemingly in passing, the name Ashcombe while discussing old noble families of the region, Elena's carefully maintained composure faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition crossing her features before she managed to suppress it. It was enough for Simon. He excused himself shortly after, claiming a prior engagement, and Elena watched him disappear into the crowded market street with a growing sense of dread settling deep within her stomach. She understood immediately that her careful reaction had likely confirmed exactly what he had come seeking to verify, and that whatever danger had followed her from her old life was now closing in around her once again, threatening not only her own safety but potentially Alaric's as well. That evening, Elena made the difficult decision to seek out Alaric directly, understanding that whatever risk existed in revealing partial truths now paled in comparison to the danger of remaining silent while threats gathered unseen around them both. She found him alone in his study, reviewing correspondence by candlelight, and requested a private moment of his time with an urgency that immediately drew his full attention. "Your Grace," she began carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking along the edge of a blade, "I have reason to believe someone may be watching me, someone connected to matters from my past that I am not entirely free to discuss. I fear my presence within your household may be placing your estate at unnecessary risk, and I believe it would be wisest for me to complete my remaining duties and depart Blackmore's territory as soon as possible." Alaric set down his letters slowly, his expression shifting from surprise into something far more serious. "Miss Voss, if you believe you are in danger, you will tell me the nature of that threat immediately. I will not allow anyone within my territory to come to harm while I have the power to prevent it." "I cannot fully explain," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Please understand, it is not a matter of trust, but of protecting others from danger that follows me." Alaric rose from his desk and crossed the room toward her, his expression softening into something achingly familiar, a gentleness she remembered from years long past that nearly broke through the careful walls she had built around her heart. "Elena," he said quietly, using her false name with a tenderness that made her chest ache with longing, "I have buried enough people I care for to last several lifetimes. I will not stand aside and allow another tragedy to unfold within my walls without doing everything in my power to prevent it." The sincerity in his voice, combined with the sheer exhaustion of carrying her secret alone for 7 long years, nearly broke Elena's resolve entirely in that moment. She wanted desperately to tell him everything, to finally set down the impossible weight she had carried since the night she fled through Blackmore's dark woods, but fear for his safety held her tongue in check, and she simply nodded, allowing him to believe she would confide in him fully, only when she felt it safe to do so. Over the following days, Alaric quietly increased security measures throughout the estate without drawing obvious attention, assigning additional guards to patrol the grounds and instructing his household staff to report any unfamiliar faces lingering near the property. Elena noticed these changes and understood their purpose, grateful for his protection, even as guilt gnawed at her conscience for the lies still standing between them. Meanwhile, Simon Blackwell returned to Lord Vane's territory, with his suspicions now confirmed in his own mind, though he carried no absolute proof beyond a single telling reaction to a mentioned name. Vane listened to his report with growing agitation, pacing the length of his study as old fears he believed long buried resurfaced with unsettling clarity. If Serafina Ashcombe had indeed survived and now resided within Blackmore Estate under a false identity, the danger to his position was significant, particularly given the strengthening bond apparently forming between her and the Duke. Vane understood that a direct confrontation carried enormous risk, potentially exposing his role in the events of 7 years earlier, should Serafina choose to reveal the truth to Alaric. He needed to either force her departure quietly or eliminate the threat entirely before suspicion could grow strong enough to endanger everything he had built since her disappearance. After careful deliberation, he settled on a plan designed to accomplish both objectives simultaneously, one that would appear to outside observers as nothing more than an unfortunate and tragic accident. He instructed Simon to arrange a fire within the estate's business office, where Elena conducted her daily work, timed for an evening when she typically worked alone reviewing contracts long after other staff members had retired for the night. The plan carried significant risk, but Vane calculated that the potential exposure of his earlier crimes far outweighed the danger of decisive action now, before Serafina could fully reclaim her former life and position. On the evening the plan was set into motion, Elena remained in her small office later than usual, determined to finish reviewing a particularly complex shipping contract before the following morning's deadline. She did not notice the faint smell of oil lingering near the office's exterior wall, nor the shadow moving carefully through the darkened corridor outside her door, until the first flickering orange glow became visible beneath the doorframe, accompanied by a rush of heat that sent alarm surging through her entire body. Elena rose instantly, her business instincts giving way immediately to the sharp survival reflexes honed through years of careful vigilance. She grabbed her ledgers instinctively, though she quickly abandoned them upon realizing the flames were spreading faster than she had initially anticipated, consuming the wooden shelving near the office entrance with alarming speed. She rushed to the window instead, forcing it open despite its stiff hinges, and called out for help as loudly as her voice would allow. The commotion reached the estate's night guards within moments, and shouts soon echoed through the corridors as staff members rushed to address the growing fire before it could spread further into the main house. Alaric, still awake reviewing his own correspondence in a nearby wing, heard the alarm and moved with immediate urgency, his heart seizing with fear the instant he learned the fire had begun near Elena's office. He reached the scene just as guards managed to help Elena climb safely through the window, her coat singed slightly and her hands trembling from smoke and fear, but otherwise unharmed. The relief that flooded through Alaric upon seeing her safe was so overwhelming, so intensely personal, that for a moment he forgot entirely to maintain his usual composed distance, pulling her instinctively into his arms without a single thought toward propriety or the watching eyes of his household staff. "You are safe," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he had not allowed himself to fully express in 7 long years. "Thank goodness, you are safe." Elena, still trembling from the danger she had just escaped, allowed herself the briefest moment to lean into his embrace, overwhelmed by the familiar warmth and safety she had not felt since the night everything fell apart. But as the guards began investigating the source of the fire, quickly discovering clear evidence of deliberately spread oil near the office's exterior wall, both Elena and Alaric understood, with growing dread, that this had been no accident at all. Standing amid the smoke and chaos, watching guards examine the damage with grim expressions, Elena finally understood that the danger following her had grown far too serious to continue hiding behind careful lies and half-truths. As Alaric turned to her with a look demanding answers she could no longer avoid giving, she realized the moment she had feared and quietly hoped for in equal measure had finally arrived. The moment when the truth she had carried alone for 7 agonizing years would finally need to be spoken aloud. The guards eventually contained the fire before it could spread beyond the business office, though the small room itself was left charred and ruined, its shelves and contents reduced to blackened ash. Alaric ordered the household staff to secure the estate for the remainder of the night, doubling the guards posted at every entrance, before leading Elena away from the smoke and commotion toward the quiet privacy of his study, where he intended to finally receive the answers he had been circling for weeks without quite understanding why. Elena sat across from him, her hands still trembling slightly, her coat marked with soot and the acrid smell of smoke clinging to her hair. Alaric poured her a small glass of water and set it before her without a word, his expression a careful mixture of concern and quiet, unspoken suspicion that had clearly been building within him for far longer than tonight's events alone could explain. "Someone tried to hurt you tonight," he said finally, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "This was no accident, and I believe you already suspected as much before tonight ever happened. I need you to tell me the truth now, Elena, whatever that truth may be." Elena closed her eyes for a long moment, feeling the weight of 7 years pressing down upon her all at once. She thought of Beatrice's kindness, of Nathaniel's patient guidance, of every careful lie she had told to survive, and she understood, with a clarity that finally outweighed her fear, that continuing to hide the truth now would only endanger Alaric further rather than protect him. "My name is not Elena Voss," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It never was." Alaric went very still, his eyes fixed intently on her face, as though bracing himself for something he had perhaps already begun to suspect, but had not yet allowed himself to fully believe. "7 years ago," Elena continued, forcing herself to hold his gaze despite every instinct urging her to look away. "The night before our wedding, I overheard Lord Gregory Vane arranging to have me killed. He could not bear the thought of losing me to another man, and rather than accept my choice, he decided that if I could not belong to him, I would belong to no one at all." Alaric's face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned pale. "Serafina," he breathed, the name he had not spoken aloud in years finally escaping him like a confession of its own. "I did not drown that night," she said, tears finally beginning to slip down her cheeks as 7 years of careful restraint began to crumble entirely. "I fled through the woods, left my veil by the river so everyone would believe I had died, and I ran, Alaric. I ran because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe, because I feared that if Vane knew I survived, he would simply try again, and next time he might succeed in harming you as well as me." Alaric rose from his chair slowly, moving around the desk to kneel before her, his hands reaching for hers with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. 7 years, he said, his voice breaking with emotions he had suppressed for far too long. 7 years I mourned you, Serafina. 7 years I told myself I would never love again, never trust happiness again, and you were alive this entire time. I wanted to return, she said, tears falling freely now. Every single day I wanted to return to you, but I feared what it would mean for your safety, and later, I feared you had already moved on, that revealing myself would only reopen wounds better left closed. Alaric shook his head firmly, lifting her hands to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. There has been no wound in my heart deeper than losing you, and no joy greater than learning you are alive. Whatever danger Vane still poses, we will face it together now, not apart. I will not lose you again, not after everything we have already survived. Their reunion, however, could not remain a private matter for long. The attempted fire, combined with Serafina's revelation, made clear that Lord Vane's threat remained active and dangerous, requiring immediate and decisive action to protect both Blackmore's household and the truth that had finally come to light after 7 long years of careful silence. Alaric summoned his most trusted advisors and guard captains that same night, revealing Serafina's true identity to a small, carefully selected circle bound by loyalty and discretion. Dowager Duchess Margaret, upon learning the truth, embraced Serafina with tears streaming down her own face, admitting that some part of her had suspected the truth from their very first meeting over tea, though she had not dared voice such an impossible hope aloud. Together, they began carefully piecing together evidence of Vane's involvement, both in the original plot 7 years earlier and in the more recent attempts against Serafina's life since her return. Alaric's guard captains discovered through careful investigation that the tampered carriage wheel and the deliberately set fire both bore signs of preparation, consistent with the methods used by men known to operate within Vane's territory, including descriptions matching a merchant recently seen asking suspicious questions throughout the market town. Understanding that direct accusations without solid proof could prove dangerous given Vane's influence and connections within regional courts, Alaric devised a careful plan to draw out concrete evidence of his rival's guilt. He arranged a formal gathering at Blackmore Estate, inviting regional nobility including Lord Vane himself, under the pretense of celebrating the successful completion of the trading contract that had originally brought Serafina back into his territory. Serafina, though frightened by the prospect of standing face to face once again with the man who had once ordered her death, agreed to the plan, understanding that true safety could only be achieved by exposing Vane's crimes fully and permanently, rather than continuing to live in fear of his reach. She spent the days leading up to the gathering working closely with Alaric's guard captains, carefully reviewing every detail of the plan meant to finally bring the truth into the light. On the evening of the gathering, Blackmore's great hall filled once again with the soft glow of candlelight and the quiet murmur of noble conversation, much as it had on countless occasions throughout Alaric's years as Duke. Serafina stood beside him, dressed not as Elena Voss, the accounts manager, but in fine clothing befitting her true station, her hair styled in the manner she had worn 7 years earlier, her mother's locket resting visibly at her throat for the first time in years. When Lord Vane arrived and caught sight of her standing beside Alaric, his composed expression faltered for just a moment, before he quickly masked his shock behind practiced courtesy. "Lady Ashcombe," he said carefully, his voice tight with barely concealed alarm, "I confess I am astonished to see you looking so well. We had all believed you lost these many years." "As you intended everyone to believe, Lord Vane," Serafina replied, her voice steady despite the fear still coiled tightly within her chest. "I overheard your arrangement with the man you hired 7 years ago, the night before my wedding. I have carried that knowledge with me every single day since." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the gathered nobility, as Vane's expression shifted rapidly from disbelief into something far more dangerous. "This is a serious accusation, made without any proof, beyond the word of a woman who vanished under mysterious circumstances, and now returns with an equally mysterious story." "Perhaps proof would help clarify matters then," Alaric said calmly, gesturing toward the hall's entrance, where his guard captain entered escorting a nervous, clearly frightened Simon Blackwell between 2 armed guards. Simon, having been quietly apprehended earlier that day, and offered leniency in exchange for honest testimony regarding his role in both the original plot and the recent attempts against Serafina's life, confirmed before the assembled nobility every detail of Vane's involvement, from the original arrangement made the night before the wedding, to the more recent orders given to sabotage her carriage and set fire to the estate's business office. Vane's carefully composed mask finally shattered entirely as Simon's testimony continued, his face contorting with a mixture of fury and desperation as he realized the full extent of the evidence now standing against him. He attempted briefly to argue against the credibility of a hired man's testimony, but the combination of Simon's detailed knowledge, matched carefully against evidence already gathered by Alaric's investigators, left little room for doubt among the gathered witnesses. "You could not simply accept my choice," Serafina said quietly into the tense silence that followed, her voice carrying clearly through the hall despite its softness. "You decided that if I could not belong to you, I deserved to belong to no one, not even to my own life. I have spent 7 years hiding from the consequences of your cruelty, Lord Vane. 7 years unable to live freely, unable to return to the people I loved, all because your pride could not accept rejection with any measure of grace." Vane's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of the assembled evidence and the quiet, unwavering strength in Serafina's voice. Regional authorities, present among the gathered nobility at Alaric's careful invitation, moved forward to formally address the serious charges now standing against him, charges that would ultimately strip him of both his lands and his freedom, in the months that followed, as the full investigation unfolded. In the aftermath of that night, as the truth finally settled into place, and the danger that had shadowed Serafina for 7 long years was permanently addressed, Blackmore Estate slowly began transforming back into the warm, hopeful place it had been before tragedy first struck its halls. Dowager Duchess Margaret wept tears of pure joy as she welcomed her true daughter by choice back into the family she had always hoped to share with her, while household staff, both old and new, gradually adjusted to the remarkable truth behind the mysterious Elena Voss, who had quietly won their respect during her time managing the estate's affairs. Serafina and Alaric spent the following weeks slowly reconnecting, allowing themselves the time and patience to rebuild the trust and intimacy that 7 years of separation and careful secrecy had inevitably strained, even as their love for one another remained as steady and unshaken as it had been on the night before everything fell apart. They spoke openly now of the years they had spent apart, of Serafina's quiet survival in Halvorn, and Alaric's lonely years of grief and guarded leadership, each sharing pieces of their separate journeys until the gaps between their old life and their new understanding of one another finally began to close. Word of the remarkable truth spread quickly throughout the region, and rather than facing judgment for her years spent hidden under a false identity, Serafina found herself welcomed back with genuine warmth by those who understood the impossible courage it had taken to survive alone for so long, while protecting the man she loved from further harm. Even the merchants and workers she had once served in Halvorn, upon learning the truth through traveling news, spoke fondly of the sharp, dependable young woman they had known as Elena, proud to have unknowingly played a small part in the survival of a duchess. As autumn settled gently over Blackmore's grounds, Alaric proposed once again, this time in the same garden where he had first proposed to her 7 years earlier, kneeling before her beneath the same old oak tree that had witnessed their original promise to one another. Serafina, tears of joy streaming freely down her face, accepted without a single moment of hesitation, understanding fully now the precious rarity of the second chance fate had finally granted them both. The wedding that followed was held within Blackmore's chapel on a crisp, golden afternoon, filled not with the shadow of danger that had haunted their original ceremony, but with genuine joy and celebration shared among family, household staff, and the region's nobility who had come to witness the remarkable reunion of a duke and his long-lost bride. Serafina wore a veil crafted new for the occasion, delicate and beautiful, a replacement for the one she had left behind on the riverbank so many years before, as a symbol of the sacrifice she had made to protect the man she loved. As Alaric gently lifted that new veil to seal their vows with a tender kiss before the gathered witnesses, 7 years of grief, danger, and careful survival finally gave way to the quiet, steady happiness both had feared they might never be permitted to share. Blackmore Estate, once shadowed by mystery and mourning, welcomed its true Duchess home at last, its halls filling once again with warmth, laughter, and the promise of a future finally free from the shadows of the past.